Hello and welcome to today's webinar on how to harden your MFA with machine learning. My name is Sargent and I'm the Senior Director of Product here at OneLogin, and with me today is Merritt Maxim, Senior Analyst at Forrester Research. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is going to be in listen-only mode, it is being recorded, and will later be available on the OneLogin website at onelogin.com/webinar. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit your questions at any time during this webinar so we can go ahead and answer them later. Let's talk about the agenda. When we were putting together this webinar, we thought to ourselves that there are plenty of other webinars on multi-factor authentication, or MFA, and so how can we be different? And it came down to really, how do we apply concepts like machine learning, similar to artificial intelligence, to MFA? Because it's not enough to have MFA, you also have to deploy MFA. You have to ensure that you deploy it when there's an elevated threat. And doing that requires machine learning. And this is because machine learning catches threats that static rules miss. We're going to explain what we mean by that later on this webinar. But given that, I just want to go ahead and cover the topics that you see here on the screen today. First, we're going to talk about some considerations for multi-factor authentication, MFA best practices, MFA deployment planning, machine learning trends, and then applying the machine learning to MFA, and then we'll wrap with Q&A. So with that, let me go ahead and hand it over to Merritt, who will cover the first few sections.
Hi, thanks. Thank you. This is Merritt from Forrester, and thanks for joining the session today. I'm going to spend the next probably 20 minutes or so just kind of walking you through some of the key trends that are driving multi-factor authentication, or 2FA, depending on what your preference is for acronyms today, and then hopefully give you some guidance that can give you what you need to know to determine how and what the things you need to think about as it relates to deploying two-factor in the organization before turning it back to Al and the OneLogin team to talk a little bit more about how they address some of these two-factor authentication issues themselves. So, why do we need multi-factor authentication today? It's pretty clear. You don't need to pick up any newspaper or magazine today, and you'll see no shortage of ongoing data breaches, whether they're phishing attempts or other things, and a lot of these are because organizations and hackers in particular are taking advantage of continued reliance on weak passwords. Multi-factor authentication is a mechanism by which you can hopefully eliminate or mitigate some of the risk associated with password-based authentication, and for that reason, it generates very compelling value for organizations, and that's why many organizations are looking at multi-factor authentication as a new security control to better protect their environment and their data, to help minimize breaches, and there may also be growing regulatory or compliance requirements, particularly as it relates to privileged users or users with elevated privileges for which two-factor authentication may be required. And I think we're at this moment in the industry today that multi-factor authentication has been in the marketplace for 20 years at this point, and so if you haven't at least evaluated or considered doing multi-factor authentication, now is the time to do so. You cannot no longer claim that this is a emerging technology. It hasn't been tested yet. There's still questions about it. This is a very mature and robust capability that exists and provides a lot of value, and for those organizations that do not rely on it, they continue to expose themselves to data breaches, audits, or other related fines. And so the rationale for going with a multi-factor authentication solution has never been clear today, and will only continue to be clear in the future because we're going to continue to suffer from breaches and other types of data exfiltration attempts by external parties. I think it's also important to know sometimes, particularly for business users, they may get confused between kind of verification versus authentication. And when we talk about multi-factor, really it's about those range of things, what you have, what you know, who you are. And in a traditional model, you think of it as like your ATM card, where the two factors are the physical possession of the ATM card plus your secret PIN, which is used to access at the ATM machine itself. And traditional two-factor authentication emerged along those same lines, usually in the form of a traditional standalone hardware token that users would carry around with them, plus a PIN, and use that for, say, remote access into the network from outside the four walls of the company. But what's happened in the last 15 years is we've seen an emergence of form factors as well as other data points that can be used to help provide a higher level of authentication. And some of that is data provided by the user in the form of PINs or other things. Other things can be more based on specific things in their environment, like, for instance, looking at their IP address, geolocation, time of day, device ID or device fingerprinting. So the point is that there's a wide range of options that are available to organizations today to do two-factor, and this is actually a good thing in the sense that it gives you the flexibility to find the approach that maps best to your end users in the most user-friendly manner. And 10 or 15 years ago, when hardware tokens were the primary mechanism, you didn't have a lot of choice. Employees were essentially given these tokens and told you have to use them. They didn't necessarily like them, or they may have resisted with them, but they didn't have a lot of choice. Today, we've got a lot of options, and ultimately, you as enterprise buyers have to assess, based on your own user characteristics and the specific use cases, what are the optimal types of form factors and data that you want to collect in a way that's going to be helping to reduce risk, but also in a way that's not going to require the user to go through a very cumbersome steps, because there is certainly an effective diminishing returns that you can ask for lots and lots of information to improve the confidence of authentication requests, but at some point users will resist that and you'll start to have other support or integration challenges. So finding that balance is an ongoing challenge. So in terms of the business benefits, those are pretty clear. By reducing your reliance on passwords, you're reducing your overall risk to your organization, which all therefore means you're reducing the risk of data breaches, and you're also hopefully leading to some compliance and regulatory processes. Another benefit that's not listed here, but is something to think about as well, as you move off passwords, there is or can be some operational benefit you realize in the form of the support costs you're enduring to deal with password-related resets. Now, when you go to multi-factor authentication, you generally are still relying on some form of password-based authentication, generally, say, for domain authentication or for maybe custom applications. So you haven't gotten rid of passwords completely, and there are certainly some support costs that come along with deploying a multi-factor authentication solution. But by going to multi-factor and integrating with a single sign-on portal like OneLogin, you are reducing the amount of passwords that users have to utilize and memorize on a daily basis, and there is certainly some end-user productivity and efficiency gain that gets realized by that type of approach longer term as well. So these are some types of benefits that we traditionally see companies looking at with multi-factor. So as we look at from a Forrester Research standpoint, kind of where are we at with multi-factor, we've had and continue to have very strong client interest around multi-factor, both in terms of understanding what are the options available to them, what are other companies doing, as well as what the kind of future holds as they look ahead for things like biometrics or other types of scenarios and how those may play a role in improving the authentication experience. Goes without saying that, Mike, in a lot of technology segments, the smartphone has really changed that mobile dynamic considerably. We can still use hardware tokens, but the ability to receive and generate one-time passcodes on the smartphone has certainly changed the user experience considerably. Users generally always have a good idea of where their mobile phone is. They don't lose them as frequently. They don't get damaged as frequently as hardware tokens. Even in a BYOD environment, users generally show a willingness to allow for receiving or generating those passcodes on a device, even if it means installing a third-party application to do that. And so that's really where that's really what's, I think, made multi-factor authentication more accessible to a lot more users now, particularly on the consumer side now, because that smartphone is now available to enable some of these capabilities that were not previously available in the old hardware token era. The interest, what's driving our client interest around multi-factor, certainly risk reduction and being concerned from an audit perspective about what are the actual threats they need to deal with and how they're ensuring that they're minimizing the risk of those threats becomes very important. There are certainly some compliance and audit considerations at play here, but it's really about just understanding what's the risk reduction. I've got some slides a little bit later phishing continues to be a major problem for organizations. The reality is users like to click on things, even if and hackers have gotten much better at creating what appear to be very legitimate emails. And so phishing is still a very there's a low cost of entry, but there's a lot of success that comes out of phishing attacks. And by implementing two-factor on certain applications, that can help minimize phishing attacks. So that's an issue. Most multi-factor solutions today are one-time passwords. We're not really talking yet about kind of biometrics. There, things like Touch ID and scenarios like that are useful, say, for authenticating to the device. But in terms of organizations going entirely to, say, a biometric mechanism for authenticating as opposed to, a one-time password, that still hasn't really happened yet. Companies are starting to think about that, but we're still very much on that kind of one-time password. One-time passwords, particularly in the mobile environment, are susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks, which is why there has been recommendations from organizations like NIST and others to move away from SMS-based delivery of the one-time passcodes. That was a guidance they issued about a year ago. That's still maybe an option or a requirement for some users in certain regions, but the way around that is to move to the kind of push-based authentication, which involves a cryptographically signed exchange between your authentication server and the end user's device. And actually, it's an easier to use mechanism because it doesn't require the user to actually type in the actual code in a web UI to authenticate. That basically the mobile device handles it all for them. So it's a nice approach and one that is gaining a lot of traction and interest from clients. There's just some data point here showing actually the year-over-year increase about firms' plans to adopt multi-factor based on our survey data. And again, we see a healthy increase. And I know when we look at the 2017 data, which we'll get later this summer, I would expect to see continued increased plans for adopting multi-factor. Again, the range of form factors, the maturity of the technology, and the value it provides is really what's driving a lot of interest in that, as well as the fact that when you can go and get multi-factor available as a SaaS subscription model, that does alleviate some of the overhead or complexity that may have stopped organizations from doing two-factor in the past. And so that's going to continue to drive this market really for the next 3 or 4 years. This is I was asking about risk-based authentication without getting any kind of confusing you on acronyms. So from a Forrester perspective, we really view risk-based authentication as more of a server-side kind of deterministic approach where at the time of authentication, the server takes into considerations like time of day, could be device fingerprinting, could be geolocation, and uses that to generate a risk score, which is then compared with previous risk scores from the user to determine if, in fact, that behavior is consistent with what that user has done in the past. And if it's not, we might flag that transaction or require the user to enter some additional information before authenticating, or if it's within the parameters that we define, we allow the transaction to proceed. The nice thing about risk-based is that it's very it's unobtrusive to the end user and it's transparent to the end user. The end user only is really aware that risk-based is being involved if, in fact, they suddenly do an authentication attempt outside of their normal parameters. So risk-based is actually increasingly important in consumer segments. It's a way to minimize fraud, but again, it doesn't really unnecessarily inconvenience the user because it only requires the user to actually take action when their behavior is out of a normal policy you've defined. And so this is just showing, again, continued interest around risk-based authentication in addition to the previous slide around multi-factor. So now we actually looked at kind of the point here about what are the actual kind of types of form factors that drive interest in multi-factor. And again, we see a wide range of alternatives here. The mobile device, the push-based model is kind of at the lead there. There still is interest in traditional hardware-based tokens, and there still are many enterprises that continue to rely on those for remote access or for other users. But then there also are other ones here. Whether you look at, say, more of a certificate-based model where it's kind of more PKI-oriented, or actually doing the risk-based stuff. So the point here is it just shows strong kind of year-over-year growth across all these categories. But this also ties into my earlier point about, one of the challenges for you as the organization is figuring out what is the actual modality or form factor that best aligns to your kind of risk profile and to your end users. And ultimately, it may actually be one or two options here, not just one, but understanding, those requirements gives you the perspective you need to make the right choice there. This is just a relative sense here. It's important, when you talk about, the ideal type of authentication one is one that's very easy to use, inexpensive to deploy, and provides, strong security. Now, that's kind of the holy grail, So the realities here, and this is just a rough approximation, that we've generated over time. We're looking, you're comparing the relative kind of cost of ownership versus the ease of use, and you can see things that, like, say, device fingerprint or geolocation are fairly easy to use because, as I said, those don't necessarily involve anything from the end user. They're just taking data from the device at this time of authentication to build in the authentication process. But they obviously means that even if the device is lost or stolen, it may still be able to be authenticated. So the security is a little bit lower. And things that provide, higher levels of assurance, like, say, biometrics or, say, a PKI certificate, generally provide a higher level of security, but with that comes a higher cost of ownership. And so you just need to kind of understand the dynamics here, and that, there are trade-offs you have to make between, ease of use versus the cost of ownership. And these are all relative in the sense that, we're not saying that things that are on the far right are too expensive to deploy. I mean, there are companies that do rely on them, but it's just making sure you aware of what these relative trade-offs are between the different types of form factors. So I talked a little bit about phishing here. This actually is an example from an academic study that was done a few years ago, actually, at Columbia University, where essentially they used a segment of the university as kind of a test subject to see, what was the likelihood that they would actually click on, a phony phishing email. And so we see here that, they basically got essentially took multiple rounds of kind of remedial training to fully inoculate the staff, if you will, from clicking on links. And again, what has happened is after each round, those group of users who clicked were actually put through, I think, like a half-hour training on the dangers of phishing and not to click on links. And, they were, went through a whole education process. That same group then got another set of phishing emails, and you still see, even after the first round of training, there still was a percentage of users that clicked on a link, and even after the third round. So this just points to the fact that phishing continues to be a real vulnerable area for organizations. And again, it doesn't require a lot of overhead for hackers to create phishing emails, and it's very easy to hide a payload in malware as an attachment or as a link on a document in an email, and to make it look very official. I know myself, even as a security professional, that I see the emails that I receive are increasingly better in sophistication. I mean, they used to be littered usually with spelling errors or other grammatical errors. That was usually a telltale sign they were fraudulent. They're getting much better now, and there have been a few recent instances where I really have had to, it's an email from an organization that I do business with, and I really have to do a quick analysis and before I click on it. And so this continues to be a problem, and is unfortunately a problem that's not going to go away, because this is a human element, and short of actually blocking all kind of external attachments or URLs, you're going to have this problem, and you're going to need to be prepared to deal with it. And that's where multi-factor can play a very important role. So if we now look at, what are some of the best practices to think about from a multi-factor perspective, there is certainly, as with any technology, there is a need to build the business case and make people aware of the value, and actually build that business case in a way that gets you the support you need. Authentication is a delicate area for companies, right? Anytime you're talking about changing the process by which users access applications, there will be resistance. Even if it's articulated to them that this is a good best practice, this helps reduce risk, helps protect our customers, helps keep us safe, there will always be some resistance saying, well, we've always done it this way, why do we have to change? And so you just need to be prepared for that. and and make sure that you've got the necessary support to build momentum in the organization and have an executive sponsor and have the appropriate people lined up to actually make things happen. There have been examples of that I've encountered when multi-factor does not go well, and that can have a very negative effect both longer term, and that companies may have tried it and determined that they're never going to do multi-factor, they're just going to rely on passwords. That's a very dangerous position to be in, but you need to be aware that there are things you need to think about to be successful and get these things deployed correctly. So when we look at, these are the types of questions we often hear from clients that are in the midst or planning to evaluate a multi-factor authentication project. It's traditionally owned by IT security, and there often is a governance or policy board of, say, 3 to 5 individuals that actually may define policy around when it's required. Is it for everyone, or only for those who are remote, or only for privileged users, or some combination of, and actually revisits that policy at some periodic basis to see if there are changes warranted based on changes in the business environment. And there are other technical groups that still play a role in a multi-factor, whether it's the application development teams that may have to do things to enable or support multi-factor in their apps, and certainly the operations team or the help desk team can play a very key role in actually providing the support, particularly when you actually go live with a rollout, and providing the necessary tutorials and communication around how to authenticate so that they understand that. That also becomes very important as well. Obviously, what are the main changes that you see with multi-factor? For end users, it does mean that you are changing the login process. They may still do a traditional username password to become a domain join machine, but then when they launch their applications, that may be then when they get prompted for two-factor. And so you do need to be aware of what that means to the user and make sure that they understand that. There are new challenges now that the help desk needs to be aware of. For instance, you have the possibility of account lockouts, particularly in the mobile application, where if the user doesn't get it correctly, and maybe if they do it in succession 3 times, maybe the account gets locked out. Now they need to be re-enabled. You also have scenarios such as lost or new devices, right? Even in a BYOD environment, users upgrade or change their mobile devices at some interval, and they'll need to go through a re-enrollment process with their mobile device, and how is that managed, and what tools are needed at the frontline support to enable users to do that in a cost-effective manner. There's also administrative changes in terms of understanding about the help desk calls, and then also being able to potentially track and monitor violations, or maybe if you see suspected authentication activity from a given account, maybe that's evidence that a device has been lost or stolen and someone's trying to access the account. And understanding all those things become very important. It's important to note with this slide that there are changes associated with multi-factor authentication, and you just need to be prepared to deal with those. A question we often hear is, why do multi-factor authentication projects fail? Often it can be because of not necessarily lack of ownership, but lack of, say, senior ownership and a senior management sponsor who's willing to really push this through. So it's not viewed purely as an IT issue that they're just trying to make my life difficult, that there is business reason for why they're doing this. End user resistance, as I said, this is not something that you always encounter, but you need to certainly be aware of and be prepared how to deal with that. There can be support concerns about, when we go particularly to a BYOD environment, does this mean that we're now going to be troubleshooting every device every problem on the end user's device? And so you need to be clear on the policies that we're going to support the app that runs on the device, but beyond that you're kind of on your own. And again, I think scoping can be a problem. This is a question we often hear about. If I'm going to go live, what's the optimal kind of go live approach? Is it kind of what I would call the big bang approach, where everyone goes live next Monday, or do we do a phased approach, say by department or by office, and we kind of scale it over time? There's, I'd say, no perfect scheduling there, but those are things that are important to think about, because if you do try to bite off more than you can chew, it can lead to a deployment that either lags or actually has real challenges. So understanding kind of your organization's ability to kind of handle a net new login method becomes very important to make sure that it's scoped appropriately. I think, to summarize here, multi-factor is not about technology. Technology plays a role, but it's really about people and process first, and making sure that you've got that ownership structure in place and that you understand kind of the workflow of how this actually works. And once you have that aligned, the technology piece is actually fairly easy to layer on top of that. If you don't really consider the people and process implications and you try to do a technology implement on top of that, that's a potential recipe for failure, because it just means that your kind of own internal operational challenges can get really caught up in that. So making sure you understand that becomes very important. Communication is really a key point here. I can't stress that enough, particularly to your rank and file employees, to make them aware that this thing is coming. This is what it involves. Here's some tutorials or documentation on how to do that. Your users aren't going to read the documentation necessarily, but at least have it available to them. They will review it if they are having a problem, and there's a mechanism for them to find that. So understanding all these things become important. And I think lastly, and this is certainly something OneLogin can talk about as well, is that multi-factor is a very important capability, but it's also important within the concept of a broader identity and access management strategy. So when coupled with single sign-on or other capabilities, it provides a lot of value. And so while you may just be looking to solve a tactical authentication problem now, it's important to think about that problem within the broader strategic aspects you're thinking of with identity, and whether there's other longer-term things that would benefit from a multi-factor like single sign-on as an example, and how this can be addressed. So just kind of moving towards the close here. So what are the things we need to do about planning the deployment here? So I'd say there's kind of three considerations here. It's the who, where, and how. So the first is it can be an easy question about, are we doing this for everyone, or only for certain users or certain offices? Again, most companies today, it's usually for every user, but there may be some companies that for every reason they're just going to do it for those users with, say, higher levels of access. There's no right or wrong here, but understanding what users will be involved with this helps to scale the deployment. Secondly is when's it going to be required? And this, again, is a policy decision. Do you require this only for those users who are remote to the network, or do you want to require it for every user anytime they access a certain set of applications, regardless where they are, we're going to require it? And again, that these are things that you can change over time. Users actually are surprisingly, I think, resilient or accepting it once they've kind of gotten used to it. But making sure you have that scoped out becomes important. And then lastly is, what's the form factor? And again, the good news is there's lots of options here, but understanding that you need to think about that becomes a key aspect. And it's also important to think, even at a very specialized level, that even if it's a BYOD environment, don't assume that every user has an iOS or Android phone. There are still people out there with Windows phones or Blackberries that are still very happy users, but those platforms don't necessarily always have apps, or there may be other scenarios you have to work with for those devices. So when you go live, make sure you're aware of the kind of heterogeneity of devices, and that you understand if there are limitations on platforms, that you're clearly explicit to users to say that certain platforms will not be supported, or they'll be supported in different ways. These become key aspects to making the deployment a success. I think, from a people and process standpoint, you need to get line of business and senior execs involved here. Make sure they understand. They're going to be part of this process too, right? They're certainly going to be involved with the authentication, so they need to be on board. The good news is that boards are increasingly aware of cybersecurity, and so anything that is presented as a means to improve cybersecurity will be met, I think, very positively. But understanding that, and then also having that risk-based view of things, so you understand, based on where you decide to deploy two-factor, what risk you're willing to tolerate, and also what potential risk you're hoping to minimize. It's important to as you look to sell multi-factor internally, that having that presentation for executives as well as metrics becomes important, both to show pre and post deployment, the success you got. Now, it's hard to estimate, say, well, we've reduced our phishing attacks by X, but in many cases, you probably have been phished, and you have a sense of the support cost that goes along with solving or remediating phishing problems, which might include, re-imaging an entire user's desktop and having that user be kind of unproductive for some period of time. And you might be able to look at, your reduction in phishing attempts over time as an example of some operational savings that are being generated by going to two-factor. And so those metrics become very important just to show to the execs that you are generating value for them. So kind of in keeping with the theme of this webinar on machine learning, I want to just talk kind of briefly about kind of machine learning trends. This is a very high interest topic area across Forrester, not just in security and risk, and really no tech vendor presentation today is complete without discussion of machine learning, because this is really a very key aspect for how a lot of capabilities are being delivered. And again, this is really just some characteristics of some colleagues of mine that have done a lot of recent research around machine learning automation, but understanding that there's a range of different kind of characteristics that are involved in actually doing machine learning automation, and starting with the configuration, and then how you actually then monitor that over time. And it's important to understand too that machine learning apps are the idea that they're going to adapt to changing conditions or changing environments, and that's, I think, where when we start, this is where it gets interesting from a authentication standpoint, where now you can start to do at a behavioral level to actually look at changes either at an individual user level or at an individual group level. So for instance, maybe there's been some, there's new products and users are now authenticating more off-site, off hours now because they need to access certain systems. Now, in a traditional model, that might have gotten potentially flagged as unusual or suspicious behavior. But if you have the algorithms tuned, the machine learning apps may be able, again, adjust to that type of behavior over time and see the difference, and therefore doesn't have an impact on end users in any way, but the models adapt over time, and that becomes a very important aspect. And we didn't really talk a lot about behavioral biometrics here, but that's another area, emerging kind of authentication model that is using a lot of machine learning behind it. And the general idea behind that is these are products, essentially are agents that run on your local desktop and kind of look at how you interact with your apps, with the keyboard or the mouse, and kind of use that in kind of real time, or what's called continuous authentication, to kind of verify or assess that it really is you at the keyboard. And again, in a lot of cases, there's a learning period where these devices have to literally just sit and listen and capture user behavior data, which then can feed into the machine learning. That's an example, a new area we're starting to see emerge, and it's an example of kind of how machine learning can help with authentication-related challenges. This next slide here is really just talking about, machine learning does require, a range of different goals to actually generate the kind of information you need. And again, there's a variety of types of import of data that gets imported into a machine learning system that then, is fed through the machine learning algorithms to actually generate information that can help you make better decisions. The challenge here in many cases is determining how much data these systems want to ingest. There's no shortage of data, but the more data you ingest, there may be both performance impacts, or it may just be kind of a redundancy. So understanding what the kind of level of data you want to incorporate these systems becomes very important to make sure that they are able to react and modify accordingly, and then not getting kind of overwhelmed with the amount of data you input in their system. This last slide here is just a sense of, from some survey here. It was an AI survey we held last year. But when we look at, what are the things, when people look at artificial intelligence or machine learning, and not surprisingly, many can, the top respondent was about the role of improving customer experience and support. So the ability to actually collect this data and use that to drive behaviors and help consumers, whether it makes better selections or better reduce risk as part of an ongoing transaction. These are all key factors where machine learning plays a key role, and we're really just at the start of this now. I mean, you hear people talking about the kind of the next machine age, but the machine learning is just really emerging now as a key capability across a lot of areas, and we're going to really see much more of that develop in the coming years, and the opportunities there across all sectors, not just in authentication security, are quite significant. And I think there's a lot of promise there, and that's where there's opportunity to both reduce the risk, but also improve the customer experience at the same time. So I think there's real opportunity for machine learning and helping improve and harden multi-factor authentication environments. That was the end of my portion. I know it was a bit of a whirlwind, but I wanted to kind of turn it back over to the OneLogin team now, kind of walk through about their approach and how they can apply machine learning to some of their specific multi-factor stuff. So I'll hand it back to them.
All right, thank you, Merritt. And so Merritt's given us some examples of MFA and machine intelligence and how the two work together. So now let's go ahead and talk about how those two areas tie together to be able to provide stronger security. And a few minutes ago, Merritt talked about risk-based authentication and or RBA. And with RBA, what the kinds of threats we're talking about are listed on this slide. Login attempts coming in from unfamiliar cities or countries, maybe unusual times of day or previously unseen devices, logins from multiple places that are impossible to travel between unless you're in orbit around the Earth. The problem is that writing static rules to accommodate all possible combinations of anomalies would get impossibly complex. You'd have gaps in coverage, which would represent security threats in and of themselves. And so what we do at OneLogin is we categorize all these different types of anomalies that you see on the left into 4 major buckets that you see on the right. These include your network reputation, your geographic location, your device fingerprinting, and time anomalies. And so for each user, what we're doing is we're automatically determining a user's typical user usage profiles along each of these 4 dimensions. So where do they log in from during work hours and during non-work hours, and from which device? And whenever there's deviance from that typical usage, we calculate a higher risk score. And when the risk score is high, we prompt for MFA. And we call this adaptive authentication. It's a type of risk-based authentication that uses machine intelligence because we're prompting for additional authentication factors when the risk is calculated to be higher than normal. And so let's take a look at how adaptive authentication might work in practice for the phishing attacks that Merritt mentioned earlier in his presentation. Now, I know there's a lot here, so let's go ahead and walk through this. Now, as you know, just to level set, phishing is where fraudulent email is sent, enticing a recipient to click on a link or an attachment that typically installs malware or captures credentials. And it's an incredibly common way for hackers to attack organizations. For example, in the 2017 Verizon data breach investigations report, over 90% of breaches involve some kind of phishing. So it's obviously something to keep in mind. Unfortunately, static rules are not well equipped to address this kind of threat. And this is because static rules often involve something called IP whitelisting, which treats all company IP addresses as trusted and thus is not requiring MFA. The thinking goes, if a login is coming in from the company premises, it's not high risk. But it's important, I think, to think about a case where a phishing email contains a link to install a malware on an employee laptop, and then the malware then attempts to access SaaS applications using a brute force credential attack where you're consistently, repeatedly trying many different username password combinations. And let's say eventually this attack through the malware finds the right credentials. When it does, the static rules will not challenge for MFA due to IP whitelisting if the malware is running on an employee device on the company network. And then the malware from this point can access company SaaS applications, which can then continue its attack. Now, the thing is that because this login is coming from the company network, it doesn't trigger any risks associated with coming in from a disreputable network or geography. But when you have adaptive authentication, the malware's HTTP client is a new device that we haven't seen before because it has a new device fingerprint, and that indicates high risk. So what adaptive authentication does is it challenges the malware to authenticate using two-factor authentication. Now, the malware, being software, can't exactly pull out a phone and submit a one-time password. So in this case, with adaptive authentication, the login is blocked and the phishing attack is stopped. And this brings up an important point about adaptive authentication. It doesn't have to trust a login attempt just because it's coming from a company IP address inside a firewall. It holds all login attempts to a higher standard. In other words, they need to be scrutinized not just from what IP address they're coming in from, but according to their device fingerprint and other types of anomalies. And so in this way, what we're doing is we're extending the concept of zero trust to login attempts. So as you can see here in this chart, the network reputation is low because it's a company network. The geographic location risk is low because it's a company office location. It's logging in during the day, so the time anomalies are no. But what triggers the MFA is the device fingerprint, again, because the malware is a quote-unquote device, an HTTP client that we have not seen before. So when you look at how this works from an end-user perspective, what it does is we're triggering a OneLogin's MFA application, which we call OneLogin Protect. And so here is how OneLogin Protects would work from a OneLogin perspective. First, I would once I successfully enter my login credentials into a single sign-on portal on my laptop, I would get an alert on the home screen of my phone. And I would do a long press on this alert saying access to OneLogin requested. And what would happen is then I would get these two secondary buttons for accept or deny, to accept or deny the login attempt. Now, if I click deny, my IT admin team will be immediately alerted, and then they can take appropriate actions. This could include forcing a password reset or disabling my account. So if someone is trying to take over my account, IT could immediately block that. Now, the key here is that there's a human involved in deciding what action to take. So a good example of why this is helpful is that a couple of months ago, I fat-fingered the screen you see here, and I clicked deny to a legitimate MFA prompt where I should have clicked accept. So I was immediately able to send a Slack message to our IT team, and they were able to know that my account hadn't been compromised. So anyway, that's the behavior of the deny button on the bottom. Now let's talk about the accept button. So if I click accept, what will happen is I will get access on my laptop to the OneLogin single sign-on portal, and from here I can simply click on each one of these icons to open any of the applications you see here or any of my company apps without having to log in again. And if I have a watch paired with my phone, I can simply accept or deny login attempts on my watch without even having to bother pulling out my phone. Now, this works on Apple's and Google's phone and watch operating systems, which covers the needs of pretty much all of your users. And we've put a lot of work into streamlining OneLogin Protect so it provides the most frictionless user experience of any additional authentication factor. However, if OneLogin adaptive authentication, that's the server side where we look at the different types of anomalies in usage behavior, that doesn't have to use OneLogin Protect, the client side, as its additional authentication factor. You can swap in a range of factors from Duo, Google, RSA, and a number of others that you see on the screen. So if you've already standardized on a particular authentication factor, you don't need to rip it out in order to start using adaptive authentication and machine learning to determine when to deploy MFA. We also provide the ability to use SMS in case you have users that don't have iOS or Android phones. So again, this helps you ensure that everyone in your organization can be more secure through MFA. And another nice thing is that with OneLogin, you can apply MFA across your entire infrastructure. You can use MFA to protect your SaaS applications running in the cloud, as well as on-premise applications. You can use it for internally built custom applications, whether they're running in the cloud or on-prem. You can use it to secure your cloud infrastructure, whether it's Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud. And thanks to our Radius integration, you can use it to secure your VPN and your Wi-Fi. To learn more about OneLogin's machine learning-powered MFA, please go ahead and visit onelogin.com/MFA. Additionally, everyone on this webinar can download a copy of our new white paper on risk-based authentication. If you look in the control panel for GoToWebinar, you should see the download link there. We'll also be emailing this white paper out to everybody who registered for this webinar, so please keep an eye out for that to arrive in your inbox. Now this concludes the prepared section of our webinar, and let's go ahead and take a look at what questions folks have submitted. I'll go ahead and read off the questions and pass on the relevant ones to Merritt. So with that, let me go ahead and do that. So the first question that we have is around, we're thinking of deploying MFA, and what are the different things we need to be successful? And Merritt, why don't you go ahead and take that, because I think you kind of covered that in one of your previous slides.
Yeah, I mean, success is, obviously you have to define success in different ways. I mean, there is probably a need to build a business case, because obviously there's some budget, there's some capital spending required to do a deployment like this. And again, some of the actual costs or benefits may be harder to estimate than others, because they're reducing the reduction of a breach. There's a lot of value there about how do you actually model that, but you can do some fairly simple kind of rudimentary assessments there. I mean, there's good data on kind of how much data breaches cost, what the remediation effort is, and also from a staffing perspective. And so, if you're just purely looking at it from a risk standpoint, you can start to say that multi-factor is going to minimize our risk of a breach by a certain percent, and that yields us also some benefit that way. So that's I think couching it in that term becomes a very useful mechanism. And other things like there are potential productivity benefits that get realized through going to multi-factor. So all those things are ways to build a business case, and it's also, I think it's very important, like with any technical product, is making sure that you've got some alliance in the business to actually support you in your efforts, because this is going to involve integrating with certain business applications, whether it's your Salesforce or Office 365 or things like that. And so there will be some impacts there. And so having that support from the executives or from the business people will become very important when it actually comes time to actually deploy this out, so that users can't just push back and say, I'm not going to do this. No, you actually have a management team member who's actually saying, no, we're going to do this, and this is why. That usually helps, I think, minimize the risk of a failed deployment. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Another question is, what are your thoughts on killing the password altogether? Merritt, I'll go ahead and pass it on to you for your comments, and then I'll go ahead and add in any follow-up thoughts I have.
I mean, kill the password is a useful strategic goal to have in the back of your mind. The reality is the moving to a passwordless free world is still somewhere off in the future. There are still legacy apps that still don't support SAML or don't integrate well with the traditional two-factor, or particularly if they're legacy mainframe apps or things like that. And so, well, you can certainly reduce usage of passwords. Killing 100% of passwords is still probably somewhere off in the future, but as a useful kind of construct for how you approach things, it's still useful. And it's also important to at least envision when you do, like, say, scenario planning, what would a passwordless free environment in your organization look like? Is it purely multi-factor, or do biometrics play a role? Does risk-based play a role? And then I think you could do some kind of assessment in your organization of what your ideal scenario would look like, and then go see about what's actually required to actually enable you to realize that maybe in the next, say, 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I guess I would add that, Merritt, in your earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that the essence of multi-factor authentication is multiple factors. And so something you know, something you have, and something you do. And so what we're looking to do here is, something you know is a password. Now, is that sufficient? No, but it certainly is an additional factor that helps raise the bar. What people typically call MFA is something you have, so your phone, but having something you know and something you have is steps things up harder. It becomes harder for an attacker to both know your password and to have your phone. And then something you do, which is what we've been talking about with risk-based authentication, adaptive authentication. In other words, where do you typically come in from in terms of your geographic location at what time of day? This also helps, again, raise the bar. So multi-factor authentication at its heart is more than just, some little app that on your phone. It's actually literally multiple factors, something you know, something you have, something you do. So I guess I would say, killing the password altogether, I think, would be peeling away one of those components. And, I think it's good to have multiple factors for more security. Another question is, why not have the accept button on top of the message and the deny button on the bottom? Because that would help with the fat finger issues. That's a really good point, and I will definitely be passing that on to our UI designer. She's done a lot of hard thinking about this, and and how do we make things as easy to use as possible. Even little details like putting the buttons a little bit up on, in terms of the button placement. And so we're going to go ahead and it's good feedback. We'll pass it on. We might be limited in terms of what we can do in terms of the OS, but again, we'll definitely pass that on. The next question is how to select the right solution for an organization. Is there a quick checklist on capabilities? Merritt, I was wondering if you might be able to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, a first thing would probably be, what is your current BYOD policy? Do you have company-issued mobile devices, or is it entirely BYOD? Because obviously that could play an impact on the kind of form factor. Obviously, most users have smartphones, but the questions about, are they, this comes into play, for instance, in the back when SMS text delivery of one-time passcodes was an issue. There are certainly, in particular for international users, that their mobile plans may actually involve they have to pay to receive text messages, and there actually were, in some cases, companies say that they had pushback from end users that they wanted to be reimbursed for the text message calls for authentication requests. So little details like that you might not think would be an issue being based in the U.S. If you're global, you need to be consideration. So I think the BYOD scenario comes into play, and then I think you could even do a quick summary or survey of a select number of staff members and understand kind of what their preferences are. The good news from a two-factor authentication perspective is that many of us use two-factor in our personal or consumer lives today. So this is not as if this is a technology that users have never had any previous experience with. And so there may be examples of ones that they really like, maybe say with their banking provider, or ones that they don't like, and you can use those as kind of examples. And you don't have to do a global survey of the entire employee base, but even talking with maybe 10 or 20 kind of select users is a good way to kind of understand both the relative acceptance and tolerance for certain technology, and then you can use that to determine what the right form factor and delivery mechanism would be for your users based on the scenario you're trying to solve.
Thanks, Merritt. Another question is what multi-factor authentication options exist for mobile? Sort of a related question.
So obviously we talked about the push-based one-time passcode, and the basic user flow there is the user would essentially launch an app. It could be a SaaS app. That app is designated as being requiring two-factor. The user will get a push notification to their device saying that Merritt is trying to access Salesforce.com. There'd be a either accept or reject button in the app, and the user would basically select that, and then that would send a back channel note to the server saying Merritt's accepted this authentication request. We're now going to initiate a SAML-enabled SSO session. So that's what a kind of a typical mobile scenario would look like. You also have the ability, when we talk about risk-based authentication, of doing more device fingerprinting type scenarios where you're actually taking the device serial number, maybe some other hardware-specific information about the device, other information like the IP address or geolocation, using that to provide a relative risk score about the end user, and certainly that's capable on the mobile device. And then, lastly, there is the ability on a mobile device to do some form of biometrics in the form of, could be a fingerprint scan. It could even be a selfie, taking a photo and using that as facial recognition. That's still emerging at this point. There are some retail banks, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, that are experimenting with that as a concept. It hasn't really hit kind of broad stream adoption in the U.S., but I think we're going to see more of that for consumer use cases. Probably not ready yet for enterprise scenarios, but that's also one that, given the quality of the camera and the imaging on the mobile devices, that's also now an option that's available to allow an additional factor, capture of an additional factor on the mobile device itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was playing around with one of those image capture ones myself, and at least the one I was looking at, it if I was wearing glasses or not would determine, like, it would build a profile of my face, but depending on the light, which could be the time of day, the profile would be off. If I was wearing glasses, it would be off. So I think one interesting thing, just from a personal standpoint, is just look at try these things with multiple profiles if you are kicking the tires on the facial ones. Not say it'll never get there. It's just make sure that it's smart enough to build multiple profiles based on these different types of changes in lighting and glasses. All right. So that concludes our webinar. Thanks, everybody, for your questions. The webinar recording will be posted shortly at onelogin.com/webinars in case you'd like to share this with any of your colleagues. And we'd also like to thank every single one of you for taking the time out of your day to join Merritt and myself, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.